The Northwest is the capital of alternative strip cartoons, or comics for grown-ups who like their comics grown up. Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, is Seattle born and bred. But there are many more where he came from. Bill Judkins went to Fantagraphics looking for the new Bart.
Not long after Bagge began Hate, drawing young Buddy Bradley's adventures in Seattle, the Seattle music scene and the media label of Gen X and the notion of youth culture based around grunge music from Seattle, this all blew up to national attention. And Bagge had planned none of that, it was all just serendipity. As he would put it years later in interviews, when the first issue of Hate came out, there was no such thing as the phrase slacker, Generation X, grunge music. Those words didn't exist, and then, a year later, everyone was talking about it in the mainstream media. I set Hate in Seattle because that's where I lived, and I wanted to give it a sense of place. But to me, Seattle was just another city. Buddy could have moved anywhere, and it just happened to be Seattle. But then, all of a sudden, Seattle became Seattle, partially because of the grunge business. And then my comics became very, very linked with that. People naturally assumed, if they weren't already familiar with the comic, that I was jumping on this bandwagon and exploiting it, which I wasn't. It was always very much a double-edged sword. I was able to exploit it to some degree, but also it was embarrassing to some degree. Hate was more like nostalgia for me by the time I started it, since that type of life was largely behind me. I even considered having it take place in 1980 rather than 1990, but that would have been too complicated to pull off. Hate wasn't really about grunge at all. It was a factor in one storyline, and that was it. While there was a story arc about Buddy managing his friend's band, most of the stories in Hate were actually just about Buddy's love life, or dealing with various problems like weirdo roommates or being broke. Stories about being a single young man living on his own in a big city, basically, which Bagge no longer was by the time he was drawing them. He was already a husband and father. So, despite all the specific details of that cultural moment that are in Hate, there does remain something timeless about all of the comedy and drama in it decades later. Even the personality of the cast of characters, they're so archetypal I can easily imagine their modern equivalents. Besides Buddy, the perennial crank and cynic, you have his friend Stinky, the obnoxious schemer who somehow has a way with women, Buddy's neurotic girlfriend Lisa, the good-hearted but self-destructive misfit, Buddy's other girlfriend, Valerie, who's much hipper and more status-conscious, and finally George, Buddy's other roommate, who's basically a perfect snapshot of what nerdy shut-ins were like before the internet. There's also Buddy's younger brother Butch, introduced as a kid back in the Bradleys' days and now grown up into an angry, barely functioning alcoholic. He becomes much more of a major character later on. When I first read Hate as a teenager, I didn't yet know people like each of these characters exactly, but eventually I would. There are tons of memorable incidental characters too, all the different types of people who were living in Seattle at that time who made up the background to Buddy's misadventures. And Bagge really captured that moment in time perfectly with his observational powers and satirical skills as a cartoonist. Bagge was an elder Gen Xer and absolutely possessed that special irreverent humor of early Gen Xers. And here he was in what was considered ground zero of the hippest place on Earth, but he had kind of an older outsider's perspective on the whole scene, and zero sentimentality about it, which only made his depictions of that moment in cultural history truer and funnier. It was densely written, too, which you might not expect from the expressive art style, but it never feels slow because of Bagge's ear for dialogue. As the recently departed Ed Piskor of Cartoonist Kayfabe put it, I don't think I've read dialogue as natural and flowy as Peter Bagge dialogue in all of comics. And this is in addition to his ability to pace a comic story so that it never drags, even when it's just characters talking, which, as with real life, is what people do most of the time before anything actually happens. Bagge was the right cartoonist in the right place at the right time. For the sake of that all-important Gen X value, authenticity, he wove in the fashions, the personalities, and the geography of Seattle itself into his comics, but it was always in service of the stories he wanted to tell about Buddy and his friends. And those stories are just fantastic. Hate is easily one of my favorite comic book series of all time, and one of the few series I've ever bothered to collect every individual issue of, rather than just the book editions. The combination of true-to-life characterizations, exaggerated cartooning style, and crazy but down-to-earth stories that could be equal parts tragedy and comedy has never really been equaled since, in my opinion. Bagge really embodied his generation's best qualities as an artist, even at this early point in his career. The sense of emotional authenticity in his work, which worked hand in hand with his fearless sense of humor, wasn't just about capturing the way his generation spoke or what pop culture they liked or things like that. There's a heartfelt nature to the stories in Hate, which was heightened by his mastery of cartooning, which you could see still getting better with every issue. He used the cartoony exaggerations you'd see in a Looney Tunes or a Tex Avery cartoon to emphasize big dramatic moments of anger, hysteria, fear, lust, joy, etc. And these big moments are always sincere because Bagge wasn't trying to be cool or go for pathos or come up with contrived sitcom scenarios. He never cheats as a storyteller, and his characters always have integrity. They're as realistically drawn as they are unrealistically drawn. In moments of emotional intensity that are treated very seriously within the story, the characters still look cartoony. That's the contradiction of it, and its brilliance at a very contradictory time in American culture. Hate was a big success for Fantagraphics, and however much its close association with Seattle and the grunge scene brought new readers in, plenty of them got hooked regardless of that incidental connection. Because of the attention around the comics industry at this time, young adults, Gen Xers, were opening up to the idea that comics weren't just superhero stories for kids, or even superhero stories for adults for that matter. Hate was exactly the kind of comic which delivered on that promise by speaking to them so earnestly and hilariously. Only an independent cartoonist could have pulled that off the way Bagge did, compared to the Hollywoodized versions of Generation X that you mostly saw in TV or in movies. Naturally, soon enough, Hollywood did come calling for Bagge, and there was, as Bagge put it, a real sense of urgency to all of these phone calls, since everyone seemed to want to capitalize on this whole Seattle/grunge thing before the fad blows over. With the recently revitalized animation industry's new interest in adult-oriented animation, thanks to hit series like The Simpsons and Beavis and Butthead, Hate did come very close to an animated film or TV adaptation, although the only thing that's ever surfaced to the public was this 4-minute pilot written and designed by Bagge and directed by Steve Loader of Ren and Stimpy fame. Loader does a pretty good job translating Bagge's art style and the acting style of his characters. They're a natural fit for animation with their big heads and rubbery limbs. For the grunge rock scene, of course, the bubble did burst. This was the premise of the animated pilot, in fact.
Where'd everybody go? I'm beginning to think that this city's day in the sun has come and gone. Everyone's moved on to greener pastures.
No!
Sadly, sales-wise, the bubble kind of burst for alternative comics around the same time, too. As Bagge would put it in retrospect, comic book sales were about as high as they were ever going to be by 1992 to 93. It's been all downhill for this friggin' industry since then. I really do think there was a window of opportunity at this time for the American comics industry, both alternative and mainstream, to establish a permanent young adult readership, but for various reasons they blew it. And the best proof is the fact that for 20 years now, manga has been slowly filling that need, even despite American society's loss of literacy. Anyway, by the mid-90s, Generation X itself, as a cultural epoch, seemed to be winding down. Daniel Clowes, a longtime friend and colleague of Bagge's, was another great success story of Fantagraphics and a cartooning genius in his own right with his anthology series Eightball. In 1993, Fantagraphics even sponsored them to go on tour together to various comic book stores, the Hateball tour. Clowes drew a one-page strip as an epitaph to the era in the April 1994 issue of Eightball, using Bagge's characters with permission. He might have had an even clearer perspective on it than Bagge, since he didn't live in Seattle. Clowes' more realistic depiction of Buddy Bradley begins, "Upon what foundation is our culture, that of upper-middle-class urban Caucasians between the ages of 18 and 28, built? To what do we owe our particular aesthetic?" Clowes' depiction of Buddy's friend Stinky answers, "It is a culture of contrived contrariness. We listen to ineptly performed, discordant music and wear ugly, ill-fitting clothes. We fear our betters and are disinterested in anything beyond sordid details of personal degradation in our artists. Our response to a culture of sadism is to masochistically scar and wound ourselves. We pose no threat to the standing order. We have directed our rebellion inward, seeking to provoke pity, disgust, and regret in our parents, rather than the fear of patriarchal upheaval sought by previous countercultures." Buddy continues, "Unlike those previous countercultures, we are not a rejection of what came before, but a toothless hybrid, removing the basically serious intent from the movements of the late 60s and late 70s, and emerging with what amounts to little more than a fashion trend. We have extracted various aspects from those two cultures, alternative media, and self-conscious sloppiness from the former, and guiltless worship of junk from the latter, and formed an aggregate that is meaningful only in that it indicates clearly that ours is an empire in sharp decline." Clowes' depiction of Lisa concludes, "Previous youth movements looked to revolutionary truth seekers for leadership. Our heroes are mass murderers, cartoonists, and alcoholics. It's fitting that our cultural mecca is a gray, lifeless area, known previously for its rainfall and high concentration of Nazis. But, of course, the Seattle scene is over. The grunge years are behind us. We received far more attention than our unimpressive numbers, less than 1% of the population, deserved, and we will now sink into oblivion, to be remembered, perhaps, only by some even more idiotic future generation who will morbidly imitate our mannerisms in a regressive attempt to avoid the horrors that surely lie before us." And they all sob. Once again, however, Bagge was ahead of the curve, and this time on purpose. After 15 issues of Hate, which had run from spring of 1990 to the fall of 93, Buddy Bradley packed up his bags and moved back home to the suburbs of New Jersey, this time bringing along his girlfriend Lisa. The series went from indie-style black and white to full color, taking out ad space to cover the cost. This is one of the reasons I love having the original issues. Looking at ads from this period is such a time machine of alt culture. Although it disappointed some readers, Bagge basically distanced Hate from the baggage of hype around Seattle and of being known as the grunge comic. The series would continue for another 5 years across 15 more issues, and the second half of the run is a bit different from the first, becoming slower paced and focusing almost entirely around Buddy and Lisa's relationship, and the question of whether or not it would last. Buddy settles down and grows up a bit, opening a nostalgia collectibles store, which he runs with Jay, an old character from the Neat Stuff years, who hasn't completely kicked his heroin habit. As all this is happening, of course, Bagge didn't miss a step in turning his observational skills as a cartoonist to the details of the people and the sense of place in this completely different setting from Seattle. And his storytelling was only getting more impressive, especially as Hate became more dramatically focused. Major characters die, and feelings are hurt, but ultimately, it does end on a hopeful note, with Buddy and Lisa expecting their first child and deciding to get married. Peter Bagge's career in comics was pretty firmly established by the time he concluded Hate in 1998, and ever since then he's done all kinds of neat stuff, from original graphic novels to miniseries to political biographies, and even the occasional odd mainstream gigs, like when Marvel Comics let him do a couple of one-shots about Spider-Man and the Hulk. He wasn't completely done with Hate yet, though. Starting in 2001, a series of Hate annuals began, checking in on the domestic life of Buddy, Lisa, and now their son, Harold. Unfortunately, Bagge felt the readership just wasn't there anymore, saying that each annual sold worse than the last. In 2011, he put out the last Hate annual, in which Buddy and his family fly back to Washington State, and he meets Lisa's crazy family for the first time. Lisa's mother has cancer, and she decides to stay behind for a while, leaving Buddy and Harold to go back to Jersey on their own. And that was it. In 2020, Fantagraphics published a big hardcover collection of the complete Hate, and it looked like Buddy's story would remain indefinitely incomplete. Then, in February of 2024, Fantagraphics announced the return of Buddy Bradley with Hate Revisited, a 4-issue miniseries debuting later in the year. I was beside myself with excitement, but not alone, because I was able to share this news with one of my online friends who was also a big fan, and crazily enough, we'd recently been having a lot of chats about what Hate would look like now, what Buddy and his friends would think of modern-day Seattle, not to mention the rest of the modern world. A lot had changed since 2011. Specifically, we figured that if Buddy and Lisa were ever to visit their old friends in the city, they'd find that Buddy's ex-girlfriend Val had become more uptight and ultra-progressive as she'd gotten older, like so many Gen Xers. We figured that Buddy might be a Trump guy, if only out of sheer contrariness. He might love that Trump pissed people off, just as Buddy was always pissing people off in the early days of Seattle's political correctness. And from the cover illustration alone of Hate Revisited, #1, it looked like maybe Peter Bagge had some similar ideas. While I was doing research for this video, I happened upon one of the worst articles I've ever read, which just happened to be published at the Seattle Weekly. It was ostensibly a review of the big box set re-release of Neat Stuff, but the headline was, Pete Bagge speaks to the racial and sexist tension undergirding his early comic series Neat Stuff. Author Kelton Sears begins, Pete Bagge's most celebrated comics have always made me cringe. His characters, modeled after the cartoon grotesques of Basil Wolverton and Tex Avery, are all perpetually horny, shouting cretins, spitting out racist and misogynist epithets left and right. They feel like Looney Tunes episodes produced for angry young white guys. Kelton Sears, by the way, young white guy when he wrote this, but I guess he wouldn't identify as angry, despite the self-righteous, scolding tone of this article. Kelton continues, first reading Buddy Does Seattle, the collection of those Seattle-based hate issues, instead of feeling a pang of provincial pride, I shuddered. The female characters are almost universally insane, sex-crazed, and taken advantage of, and the protagonist, the semi-autobiographical Buddy Bradley, casually throws around the N-word throughout. Whether you want to call it satire, black humor, or both, yeesh. Curiously, write-ups on Bagge almost never touch on this, whether that's an oversight induced by his vaunted reputation, or simply because his characters sometimes scream at each other for these transgressions, has always been a little unclear to me. The punchline to all this, by the way, is that Kelton was the editor of the Culture and Comics section of the Seattle Weekly when he wrote that. And his main takeaway about the most famous comic book series to ever come out of Seattle, one which helped establish Fantagraphics as a respected Seattle-based comics publisher, all that mattered to him about Peter Bagge's legacy and body of work was that he deserved to be reprimanded for offending him. And his only appraisal of Bagge's comics as comics was to say that he just thought they looked like wacky old cartoons. He actually had the nerve to reach out to Bagge for some quotes for this hatchet job. Although I can't imagine he was as snide to him over the phone as he was here in print, but Bagge gave him a relevant quote, which was, "When I moved here, it was very left-wing and progressive in a way where if you did or said anything and didn't check all the right boxes, they'd immediately write you off." I don't even know why Kelton included this statement, because who knows what it meant to him. Who knows if he was aware that he too was reducing Bagge's work to a checklist of social violations that he was smugly ticking the boxes off. I think he was too busy sneering at it for being the product of another time and refusing to relate to the humanity of any of it. I mean, one wonders what Kelton would have had to say if he were reviewing something by Johnny Ryan, who is still published by Fantagraphics. But I think Johnny's only been grandfathered in because he's built up a fan base over 20 years who they can count on to buy his books. I don't know if Fantagraphics would publish Angry Youth comics today when people like Kelton are setting the tone and seem so resentful that guys like Johnny Ryan or even Peter Bagge are still given any respect. I wish I could say it's just a generation gap between Gen Xers and millennials, but like I said before, a lot of Gen Xers are like this now too. The modern alternative comics scene is a pretty far cry from the edgy, irreverent 90s or even the 2000s. That's all part of the Seattle that Bagge was leaving behind when he moved upstate to Tacoma a few years ago. Anyways, I knew Buddy's return to Seattle was going to be perfect. The next few months passed by very slowly, and then, as I expected, the Fantagraphics store in Seattle announced that Peter Bagge would be coming down for a release day signing.